Next up, I want to call up three great friends of mine who are going to share with us a topic that is really important in this conversation. It's around the topic of racial disparities when we think about end-of-life care. So I want to call up Cynthia Perilliat. If I can get your stuff on the screen here. Jessica Zitter and Christine Ritchie, who will be moderating. So Cynthia has an amazing career of using faith-based work to look at serious illness and advanced illness. She's here from Oakland, where she does her work. Jessica Zitter, I just have to say, where is your? Oh, I'm holding it in my hand. This is the novel. She's both the star of the Academy Award nominating Extremis, which was out 2 years ago on Netflix. You should see that. And then this wonderful book, Extreme Measures, which you should all check out. And it's going to be moderated by my dear friend Christine Ritchie, who has more letters at the end of your title than anyone I've ever met. But she's really one of the world's leaders in palliative medicine and investigating serious illness. So with that, let's learn a little bit more about racial disparities in the end of life.
So Jessica and Cynthia, it's always a pleasure to have a chance to spend time with you, and I'm particularly interested in, there you go. I'm particularly interested in how both of you became interested in caring for people with serious illness in the community, and what drew you to that, and then a little bit more about sort of what palliative care means to you.
I guess I'll start. Thanks, Christine. So your first question was what brought me to this field, being involved in advanced illness, palliative care, hospice care. Probably like many of you, and pretty much what we've heard already tonight, it really was a personal experience that brought me to this space. And for me, it was my absolutely wonderful, adorable dad. And Dad was not only a man that was very family-oriented, but his spirituality was tremendously important to him. And he instilled that spirituality and that interest in being what we would refer to as a whole individual. So mind, body, and spirit being very important, really, in how he and Mom raised me and my other 4 siblings. And so what brought me to this field, when the doctors gave my dad a very bad prognosis. He discovered that he had prostate cancer, and on his first visit to the doctor, after seeing some very disturbing symptoms, frankly, the doctor said, "Mr. Carter, you have about 8 months to live." And so it was obviously very devastating for myself and my mom and my siblings. And you know, we're folks that really believe in the power of meditation, the power of prayer, the power, again, of the holistic approach to life. My parents were folks that ate well, that lived wonderful, adventurous lives. So when we got that bad diagnosis, we literally needed to put to work that which we believed. And for us, a strong faith in God, a strong faith in family, a strong faith in, again, the holistic nature of humanity. And I have to tell you, Christine and Jessica and all of you, that we had a positive story in that Dad not only lived 8 months, he lived an 8 very healthy years. Yeah, thank you for acknowledging the joy of that. Of course, I said 8 years, so there was an end, if you will. And so the last 6 months of that period of time, my dad really did need palliative care, ultimately hospice care. And as an African-American family, I have to be very honest with you, hospice care was very foreign to us. We didn't have a lot of information about it. And frankly, in communities of color, and I know we have a lot of clinicians in the house tonight, but I have to be real honest with you, and Jessica calls me the keep it real girl, so I'm going to live true to my, my history. in communities of color, and particularly the African American communities, there really is not a lot of trust for the healthcare systems. I know there's all kinds of studies and particular instances where African American people, for example, the Tuskegee experiment was a very negative experiment, if you will, that happened to African Americans. So I just want to respond to your question simply by saying a personal experience brought me to this space, and I am so happy to say that the holistic approach to health is really what made a difference for us.
Jessica? That's beautiful. I came to this work from the other end of that, actually. I came from the non-holistic, very piecemeal, organ-focused, disease-focused approach to caring for patients. And it wore me out. And I was lucky enough to find, actually palliative care found me, because I happened to be working at a hospital as an ICU doctor, taking care of my patients at arm's length, looking at their organs through a microscope. And I was very lucky to be in a hospital, small hospital in Newark, New Jersey, that happened to be one of the first hospitals, one of 4 early hospitals that looked and wanted to look at the issue of communication in the intensive care unit. And they got this grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, these 4 hospitals around the country out of about 400 applicants. And I happened to be in one of these hospitals, and the palliative care team, at that time it was called the family support team because no one knew what palliative care was, found me and shook their finger at me and said, "Why are you taking care of these patients in such a non-holistic way? Aren't you talking to your patients? Aren't you checking out their pain? Aren't you paying attention to their families?" The exact opposite of what your experience was. And I was just lucky enough to be there and to receive that kind of coaching and to learn about this new movement. And to connect again with my patients, which is why I had originally come into medicine, and to find my own humanity again. And I would say that that's how I sort of reconnected as a doctor, as a human being to my patients, found through the palliative care movement. But the other thing that brought me to this work, which still brings me to this work every day, is a sense of the lack of fairness that I knew so much about what was going to happen to people and their bodies and their families that they didn't know. This lack of information transfer and the unfairness, the lack of, I would call it a lack of an injustice. And I think that's a big part of why I came to this work. So
Thanks. So both of you have alluded to some of this disparity that we see in end-of-life care and in serious illness care, and I wonder if you could describe some of those disparities in more detail, what we're really talking about here when we talk about disparities for people who have serious illness or how they experience the end of life.
Sure. I'll give it to you from my perspective.
Okay.
Because, you know, I come at it, I'm a doctor. First of all, the data is very clear, and the data is disturbingly clear that in all aspects of our healthcare system, African American patients get the short end of the stick. What's interesting when it comes to the end of life is that the short end of the stick looks different. It looks like more intervention. It looks like more technology, and accompanying that is less communication. So, you know, having worked myself in hospitals in Newark, New Jersey, and Oakland, California, public hospitals, many of my patients were African American, and, you know, I couldn't help but notice the fact that I was probably not communicating as therapeutically as I would have liked, because there was a cultural difference and I was hiding behind my machines. I was doing that with all my patients, but anytime there was a patient who I had differences with, whether it's a language difference, a cultural difference, I just had such a convenient thing to hide behind, to sort of just focus in on this procedure or that aspect of the organ. And so I speak from a personal place of saying that I noticed that I was often not connected with my patients, my African American patients. I noticed the lack of trust, and I felt bad about it, but I didn't really know how to bridge that gap. I noticed that I'd come in the room and I would make a recommendation and I would get a sense of, who are you and why are you saying this to me? And it really was distressing to me, and I think it's only over the last several years and through the palliative care movement and through working with a chaplain who works with Cynthia in her amazing organization, Betty Clark, who has taught me about how important it is to really reach out to my patients in a different way. That was a long-winded answer, but I'm going to let you take it from here.
So your question was about disparities and
Just describing
what those disparities look like. So disparities, particularly in communities of color and African American communities, as an example, first and foremost, because there is this mistrust for the healthcare system, typically people are unaware of opportunities, number one, that exist, like what is palliative care? What is hospice care? How can that be beneficial to me and my family given our particular scenario? So this whole notion of disparities, much of it comes around communication, language that's used. Jessica and I talk about it often. Coming from my undergrad is in business. My master's is in public administration that focuses on health and organizational change. But underneath it all is a very important part of my being, and that is, as you might imagine, my faith and my spirituality. And so when, quote unquote, you hear terms like, I'm believing for a miracle, I'm believing that something is going to come out of this scenario that will defy what a Dr. Jessica Zitter or a Dr. Christine Ritchie might say, then many times the look is like, okay, these folks are really in denial of what's really happening. And so that's a very challenging scenario. In other words, there's disparity in communication and in understanding. In our situation, we would say that was a miracle. My dad outlived what the diagnosis was and the prognosis, basically, for his health. And so other issues, African Americans as an example, when it comes to cancer and heart disease and most modalities as it relates to health, they tend to have some of the worst outcomes. Many times it's because they're not going to the doctor in timely ways, and some of that's often, again, attached to this whole notion of whether they have the insurance that they need to have, or again, not feeling that there is a real communication and a connection with this individual that is prescribing medicine to them, as an example. So there's a whole long list of issues when you start thinking about the disparities. But the heart and soul of it is, I think, that number one, people don't feel that they're being heard. Number two, they don't trust the system. And number three, because of a lot of past history, they really don't follow through with issues around their health that they could also take more responsibility in. So it's not like I can point my fingers and say, you white people have caused me to be in this situation. That's not what we're saying, but we have to deal with the realities of the history that has happened to African Americans as a people and people of color.
So both of you have talked about palliative care, and just to make sure we've got a lot of different folks here, we're all on the same page about what you mean. Can you just maybe define palliative care, one of you define palliative care for us so we're all sort of understanding what that means?
Sure. You want to take it first, or you want me? Okay. So palliative care really is a type of care or medicine, a practice, where you're looking at people from a holistic perspective. And so it really rang true for me and my family because it does address mind, body, and spirit. And you don't have to be a person that's dealing with end of life to appreciate what palliative care can bring to an individual. So I'll leave it there. I try to keep it as simple as I could. Dr. Jessica, what would you say?
As I explained to you, for me, palliative care is a relatively new medical subspecialty that I think arose out of this profound lack of human connection in the healthcare system. and people suffering and studying it and seeing that people in general were dying badly. And so it's a relatively new subspecialty. And again, as Cynthia just mentioned, it really focuses on the whole person and their family and really attending. You can't really do good health care if you don't know who that person is in the bed. You know, this idea that we can just go in there and do this and do that, and do this to a person, put them on this conveyor belt of care, it just doesn't make sense. And it robs the person of choice, and it robs the professional, the healthcare provider, of a sense of providing a human connection. And it robs us all. So that's what palliative care really has started to fill. And if I could say one thing about palliative care, and I hope the palliative care practitioners in the room aren't going to kill me, but in an ideal world, we wouldn't have palliative care, right? Forget it. We shouldn't. I have job security for decades to come, sadly, because we have a lot of culture change to make, and it's being led by the palliative care movement. But in theory, shouldn't every doctor, every healthcare provider be providing palliative care? Yes, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we've talked about palliative care. We talked about these disparities that we see in our community. What might be...
All nightlifers grab a seat to catch a special discussion on the use of psychedelic medicine with Dr. Richard Miller and Rabbi.
Coming up, psychedelics. All right, so let's just finish by talking about strategies and what might be strategies to improve disparities.
Absolutely. So strategies to deal with disparities, particularly in communities of color and communities of the quote-unquote majority community. I think what we're really looking at, and I have to say that I'm really, really proud of an organization that I happen to be the executive director of. It's called the Alameda County Care Alliance. And this organization, all right, thank you so much. And our wonderful program manager, Val Steinmetz, is here with us today. One of the really things that is really cool about this movement, and we see it as a strategy, is that not only are people viewed important that are dealing with illness, they are obviously number one. The caregivers are also tremendously important. We saw Brad ask how many folks are caregivers, and I know there were a number of hands that went up. There are a lot of folks that are caregivers but don't even realize they're caregivers because they're so inundated with taking care of their loved one, and they're not taking care of themselves. And so our movement embraces the person that needs care and also the person that's a caregiver. And so our strategy is what we call, and I often refer to it, all hands on deck, meaning we can train individuals in the community as community care navigators. Many of them come out of their faith context, so they work within their church. These are paid positions, folks. And we have a team of folks that work along with them, but specifically, they help people to embrace their holistic nature. Again, mind, body, and spirit. But if individuals aren't interested in the quote-unquote spiritual, we embrace them as well. Because when it comes down to it, folks, there's so much more that we have in common, and that we're all of the human race. And so embracing one another from a holistic human perspective is really what we're all about. So the strategy is, why don't we all get involved, right? There's room for everybody to participate in what we often refer to as the silver tsunami. We're all aging, and we're all ultimately going to leave this earth one form or another. So let's find ways, creative ways, and strategies to educate, to train individuals that aren't necessarily clinicians, but are caring, compassionate individuals that, oh, by the way, have been caregivers, and so they really get a hold of what it means to be human and to be present with individuals that are dealing with advanced illness.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
What she said. And I would, as a white Jewish doctor, I would say that I've learned several things. First of all, I can't say enough about how much I support the ACCA and what they're doing. Training clergy members and people in the community to provide information to people in the community is a much better preparation than having some white doctor walk in at the 11th hour and say, hey, should we consider changing goals of care? So I think preparing the community through trusted leaders is a critically important piece. The other thing I've learned is that when I walk into a room, sometimes with Betty Clark, the chaplain on our palliative care team who's African American, I feel 10 feet closer to my patients a lot of times. Not every time do I need to, but sometimes you just having a diverse approach and a diverse team is very, very important. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, for all the clinicians out there, is asking questions and listening and really being curious about people as human beings. No matter how different they may be, just wanting to know about their lives is really ultimately what I think it's all about.
Here, here. Totally agree.
So we have a call to action, and this is something we can all be a part of, which is to address these disparities and try to really help, as a community, give people the opportunity to have a better journey as they address their own serious illness. So thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you guys so much. How about a big round of applause for this wonderful panel? You know, it does make me think, because first of all, a lot of you are here right now for a conversation on psychedelics and the end of life, but something we learn about end of life and endings in general is that no one really teaches us how to end things. So as you saw, there was some bumbling, like the things go later and longer than you think, and that's the way, you know, people live longer or shorter than you think. You never know how something's going to quite go. So we're embracing that here tonight. And